hope that you enjoyed this morning's keynote speeches. Today's agenda includes breakout sessions this morning, a general session lunch at noon, and more breakout sessions this afternoon, followed by the opening of the exhibit hall. From 7 to 8:30, West Tower will be hosting the opening reception in Gatlin D and E foyer patio. And this reception is open to all VIP, full access, and Expo Plus badge holders. Today's session is sponsored by Atlas Towers. Atlas Towers is an independent infrastructure owner with high-value tower sites in the U.S. and Africa. The sites are high quality and structurally sound. The sites are located to meet current network needs, but designed to solve future capacity and backhaul challenges. They combine small company accountability with great customer service process. The goal is a fast, cheap, and painless co-location process, and in turn, a tenant mandate for more Atlas Towers. It is now my pleasure to introduce the moderator of our session, Martha DeGrasse, with RCR Wireless News. She is the editor of RCR Wireless News and host of the RCR Mobile Minute. Martha has been with RCR since 2011. Recent RCR feature reports authored by Martha include Wireless Infrastructure Company Review and Video Optimization and Monetization for Carriers. Prior to joining RCR, Martha produced business and technology news for CNN and Dow Jones in New York. Martha left Dow Jones to move to Austin, where she managed the online editorial group at Hoover's Online, before taking a number of years off to be at home when her children were young. Please help me in welcoming Martha.
Thank you, and it's my pleasure to introduce our panel today. Nathan Foster is president of Atlas Tower, and each member of the panel is going to take just a minute to tell us a little bit about their company and his roles and responsibilities there.
Thank you. Atlas Tower has been around since 2006. We're based in Boulder, Colorado. We have operations in the U.S. and now in South Africa. And the rest of it was explained eloquently before.
Okay, Olivier Puech is here. He is CEO for Latin America for American Tower. Olivier, thanks for being here today.
Thank you, Martha, for the invitation. Good morning, everyone. Olivier Puech. I'm heading Latin America for American Tower. Started in the company about a year ago. I'm relatively new to the tower industry, not to telecommunication. I've been with Nokia for 15 years in Asia, Europe, the US, and Latin America. So it's my pleasure to be here.
Okay, and Alex Gelman is CEO of Vertical Bridge Holdings. Alex, thanks for being here. Please take a minute to tell us a little bit about Vertical Bridge.
Sure, thanks, Martha. I'm happy to be here. Appreciate the opportunity. Vertical Bridge is basically a tower company focused in this hemisphere. We're a startup. I think a lot of you know I was with GTP as the president and COO up until Olivier and his colleagues were kind enough to take over stewardship of those assets. I hope they're doing well for you. And we're planning to do it again.
Okay, thank you very much. And Patrick Tangy is chairman of Golden Towers. Patrick, thanks for being here today.
Thank you, Martha. Patrick Tangy. I am a partner with Alcazar Capital, which is a principal investment firm based in Dubai. We focused mostly on the venture side of the spectrum of venture through private equity. We invest, among other things, in telecom infrastructure, and we have started and sponsored 2 tower companies located in Southeast Asia. One's located in Vietnam, and the other is located in Myanmar, which used to be called Burma.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, I think we got a great introduction to this panel for those of us that were downstairs earlier with Crown Castle, American Tower, and SVAC. I think we heard 2 very different approaches to international investment outlined by Crown Castle and American Tower. So clearly, you know, American Tower does see that the risks justify the potential return. So Olivier, I'm hoping that you can start us off by talking a little more in depth about how you do evaluate those international risks.
Sure. So yes, as you say, I think American Tower, we took the stance a few years ago already to get into international markets. I think initially it was more opportunistic when we started in Mexico and in Brazil in 99 and 2000. So we've been in these markets already for 15 years. And then looking at the growth opportunity, not only in this market, but in other markets internationally, we decided to move forward more strategically, I would say more proactively in these markets by adding more assets. and also entering new geographies. So after that, not only we developed more markets in Latin America, more recently Colombia, Peru, Chile, Costa Rica, and Panama. Also, we entered Africa more proactively, being present today in 3 markets, Ghana, Uganda, and South Africa. India, which is of course a big market for us and for the industry in general, and Germany. So there was an opportunity also 2 years ago to enter Germany through the acquisition of the towers from E+, and we decided to enter Europe as well. So yes, I think it's a proactive strategy that we've been developing for these past 15 years with a good return. So of course it's a mixed bag when you look at the objectives that we have. If you compare Germany to Ghana or Uganda, you have a very different level of development in terms of the tower industry, infrastructure in general, consolidation of operators and players in this market, regulation. But again, for us, the return has been very positive. So definitely we're committed to international markets and continue on
Okay,
this path.
great. And we are going to touch on some of those issues that you just brought up. But I'd also like to hear a little bit about the co-location model in those markets. It looks like you have a number of carriers in most of those markets, but can you just speak a little bit about how that's working?
Yeah, so I think this morning Rod was mentioning the tenancy rate that we have in the US, which is around 2.5, 2.6. Typically, today in the international market, we're more around 1.6, 1.7. We acquired many of these assets when there was one tenant, so there was the anchor tenant that basically started building the towers, and we acquired this portfolio with only one player on the tower, and then we grew these assets over time. And today, I mean, again, we're extremely happy with the returns that we see in markets like Brazil and Mexico. We are close to 2 tenants in Mexico, for instance, which is the older market that we have internationally. We see a lot of traction in Africa, of course, because of the very low penetration. So there's a lot of needs in terms of development. And for many carriers, especially the new ones, time is of the essence. So for them, it's much better to co-locate on existing towers than building new towers. So that's that's been for us the way to surf the wave, if you want, of the growth in many of these markets. Same in Brazil, which has been booming for us for the past I would say 7 years. New spectrum allocation, new players. Needs to cover very extensive geography when you look at the geography of a country like Brazil. So I think our business model has paid off relatively well in this sense.
Okay, thank you very much, Olivier. Now, purchasing existing assets in the market is somewhat different than a greenfield tower rollout. Patrick, can you give us a little bit of information about the risks associated with a greenfield rollout?
Sure. So as mentioned, we're active at the moment in Vietnam and Myanmar, which are 2 markets which are probably pretty good illustrations of the difference between acquiring existing established towers and building new towers. So Vietnam is a market that has, in theory, 7 operators. Myanmar is a market which was effectively closed to the outside world until very recently. They just issued 2 new licenses, which were issued to Telenor and to Ooredoo, the former QTEL. The incumbent there had 8% penetration as of about 6 or 7 months ago. So that market effectively requires entirely building an entire new set of tower infrastructure. Vietnam's a little bit different. Vietnam actually has a lot of towers, but they tend to be mostly guide monopoles that are operator specific and only have 1 operator on them. There, the growth is a combination of consolidation, building new towers for operators who are probably less established, and infill for operators who are more established. So in evaluating these, we tend to look at the credit capacity of the particular operator for whom we're building towers, how attractive it is to build new towers in the market in terms of the penetration that already exists in the market, the scope for increasing the capacity for existing operators, and we also, of course, look at when the newer operators, all of whom obviously are interested in both in selling their towers and in rolling out new towers, but we generally don't regard from a credit perspective as interesting for us as tenants. How do we combine the desires of those newer operators with building out new towers? And in the end, kind of the way we look at it is that we tend to have a gross yield-driven approach to new build, and we try to mitigate what is obviously a much higher risk with new build by ensuring that we have a reasonably high gross yield and even higher net yield, and that the particular tenants for whom we're building for are tenants that we believe are likely to still be in the market 5 years later.
Okay, great. Thank you, Patrick. Next, we're going to talk a little bit about the risks and challenges associated with establishing a business overseas, and certainly this varies greatly from market to market. But Nathan, can you start us off with a little bit of information about some of the things that you've learned?
Yes, thank you. First of all, if you've started a business in the U.S. And you've complained about it, you need to go to a foreign country and try the same thing, because you'll have a new vision and a new optimism for your own country. The first thing you have to do is figure out your exit. Now this particular group, we're in the tower business, so you should probably understand that there's a high likelihood of an exit in 3, 4, 5 years. So once you've figured out what that time frame is, you need to create your corporate structure so that you maximize your tax risk and lower your tax obligation. Obviously, we're familiar with LLCs and corporations in the U.S. In foreign countries, you'll have PMBRs, you'll have proprietary limiteds, you'll have co-ops, and each one of them means something different country to country. So you really have to understand your tax obligations, not just from the equity piece. In other words, if you've got a private equity backer, not just for what it looks like from their perspective, but if you have a management team who hopes to get somewhat rich off this endeavor, they need to understand the taxable implications of their shares too. But surprisingly, it's very similar. If you go into a new country, you have to set up the name, you have to set up the registration at the federal level. You might have registered agents that you have to set up in different provinces that you work. You'll have workman's comp issues, funds and unemployment funds you have to sign up for. So there's a lot of similarities, but there's VAT, which is something we don't have in the U.S. So VAT tax you have to deal with and administer. And the other thing that we found surprising, and again, we're primarily interested in the SADC, which is the Southern African Development Community. A lot of those countries actually have a licensing program or process for tower codes. So if you are a telecom infrastructure owner, you actually will have to be licensed at the federal level, just like a carrier or an MNO has to be. So we find that a little bit surprising. I'd say I guess the other biggest challenge is that if a country you're entering is a pen and paper country or an online country, your costs and your timeframes are going to be drastically different. If you expect to get something through a process in 2 months, 3 months, that's probably because it's an online or technologically advanced country from a federal level. But if it's a country more third world, add 8 months, add 10 months, add costs of consultants to help speed up the process. So that's obviously a unique thing to consider when you're in another country.
All right, thank you, Nathan. Does anybody else have anything to add on this topic? I know property tax laws were mentioned downstairs. Does anybody have anything they want to add about any of this?
You know what, just from my experience, one thing, you really need to understand the HR laws as well, the employment laws. You know, when you hire people directly, can you separate with them? What are the laws in that country? It's really important for them and for you.
Okay, great. And I think we're going to talk a little bit more about the whole hiring issues in a couple minutes here. But right now we're going to switch over and talk about a little more about the more granular regulatory processes involved with site location. And Alex, I think you're going to start us off here.
Sure. Well, I mean, it sounds kind of obvious, but I think it's really important to go to school and understand what the laws are in that jurisdiction, because they're very, very different. You know, we started up in Costa Rica, Mexico, basically at the same time, and they're night and day different in terms of siting and regulations. In general, structurally, a lot of it's similar. You generally have national requirements, so there's going to be some kind of FAA equivalent in some countries. It's the Air Force, in some, but there's some kind of national structure height regulation. We have to file the height of certain structures, and that will have to do with lighting. And then there's usually some kind of national environmental requirement in my experience. And then you get into regional and local, which can be all very different. I think the best thing you can do is get a really strong local law firm, get the top firm for real estate in that country. You'll pay more than you want, but do it. because you're going to go to school on them about how to do it right. You know, we've seen examples. There's one example in Costa Rica. You know, the company built didn't follow the rules, and they're telling them to take the towers down. Don't want to be there. Don't want to be there. So you got to get ahead of it. And then lastly, there's twists. So like in Mexico, they have ejidos. It's a co-op. The land isn't really owned by anybody. It's sort of, it's farm, it's basically agricultural land. And increasingly, as the country's getting built out, people are trying to develop on ejidos, not just towers, but wind farms and all kinds of things. And it's very unclear what the law actually is. It's sort of like dealing with a co-op building. If you have the president of the co-op saying it's okay, is it okay? Do you need a majority? Do you need everybody? It's really important to understand this stuff before you have a problem, not after.
Yeah. Okay, you mentioned wind farms, and I know that sometimes power supply is an issue in some of these less developed markets. Patrick, can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So I think in some of the markets we're in, so Myanmar in particular, I guess would be the best example of this. Power is a pretty critical element of being a tower owner. And you know, there are obviously many emerging markets, and certain of the markets in Africa are quite similar to this, where the electric grid is either unavailable or not reliably available. And in such cases, it's often the case the operator will request that the tower company provide power. Ultimately, the SLAs you have to deliver are totally power generated, because once the tower is up and running, you know, you have fairly limited risk. I think, as Alex was saying, you certainly have situations where an operator has themselves built towers and they had informal ability to do so, and perhaps later you run into more formal legal trouble because they didn't go through a formal process. But the power side really, I think, is absolutely critical in some of these markets, because it's the key driver of the operating expense of the operators. They don't generally understand power as a general matter. They want to outsource it, and it is the area that bears the largest risk, I think, for the tower company. So being able to manage a power resource is in many emerging markets considerably more important than being able to manage the tower, quote unquote.
That is interesting. Does anybody else have anything else on power before we move on?
I would say that when we got into Africa, we were very concerned about this element, and we've been surprised to find a lot of potential partners that would completely take that part of our business away from us, because that's not our core skill in the US or there, and manage it for us. So we've been able to kind of circumvent that problem by bringing in a partner who manages the power 100% to pass through to the tenant, not us. We can keep our hands clean just like we like to in the US.
Excellent. Okay, let's move on a little bit to talk about the workforce. I think hiring and compensating workers can look very different overseas than it does here. Nathan, you want to start us off?
Again, in Africa, in Southern Africa, surprisingly, it's more similar to the US than it is Europe. We were concerned initially that we'd have a very employee-friendly environment, and certainly it's more so. It's more employee-friendly in Southern Africa than it is in the US, but the cost differential between having to pay mandated severances, maternity, paternity issues, time off, it's really not a big issue. The number one issue that we found is that for senior staff, they're very keen on their own country's inflation issues. And so we have to administer a CPI model every year, sometimes twice a year, so that the rate of inflation and their salary continues to go up. And it goes up, unfortunately, 5% one year, 12% another year. So you have to deal with that cost that you don't have to deal with in the US. Of course, using independent contractors, which was mentioned yesterday, is an option, but we found that using independent contractors at a senior level doesn't help us build our tower business. Obviously, you can feather them in at the lower level, but you need to have in-country senior staff and pay them well.
Okay, great, thanks. Now, Olivia, you're in 13 countries around the world.
Well,
Well, I'm sure you can do that.
yeah, I think the US, yes. Yeah, I mean, maybe the difference with what Nathan is saying, or maybe Alex was hinting too, is that we are there in the long run. You know, we're not neither in a startup phase nor backed by private equity with a public company where we take this kind of very long-term approach on markets. So of course, when you look at talent, it is quite important to screen the profile that you have, in especially your upper management, to make sure that they're there not only to start the operation but also to grow it. I think it's quite complex in the tower industry because you need to find people that have, on one side, a good understanding of the telecom industry, the good connection with operators, regulators, and so on, that know how to operate, complex infrastructure type of company, that also understand real estate management and somehow also the legal implication of this business. This is quite unique in this sense compared with traditional OEM manufacturers or even operators. So in this sense, I think the search for talent is quite complex. It may be easier in some markets than others. If you take Latin America, it's probably easier than Africa or part of Asia, like China and so on. But again, this is traditional to any corporation. And yes, regarding the hiring laws and the regulation, Latin America is much closer to Europe, while Africa and Asia may be a little bit closer to what the US are saying.
Okay, great. Does anybody else have anything on workforce or hiring issues?
Maybe just to throw out one other point, in some of the markets that we've encountered, I think capacity building is pretty important, both for people working for your own company and for your third-party vendors and managed service providers. So, as Nathan was mentioning, obviously there's a lot of appeal in sometimes using outsourced firms to push certain of the tasks you need to do outside of your own cost structure. In some markets, I think that that's quite reasonably doable. In certain other markets, capacity building for those partners is fairly important. So, in the two that we're most particularly active in, somewhere like Vietnam has a very deep pool of very skilled personnel and very skilled companies. Somewhere like Myanmar, obviously, is a totally different kettle of fish. So that's something that I think is kind of important. Another one that we've encountered that I think sometimes is maybe not as obvious would be that even for less skilled personnel, things like security on the site, there's so much potential risk associated with corruption related to that particular role that it's not simply a matter of finding people who are able to do it, because anyone can be a security guard at the end of the day. It's more a matter of the ecosystem in which that person sits. Are they related to influential people located in the community who can ensure that theft doesn't occur on site, et cetera, et cetera. Sometimes that type of additional layer of nuance is difficult to appreciate as a foreigner.
Okay, thank you. Now, you did mention corruption, and we know the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act prevents any payments that could possibly be construed as bribery. Alex, can you talk a little
Technically,
bit?
it actually only requires that you disclose them, not that you not make them. But
Very good point. All right, why don't you start us off on this one?
Oh, okay. Yeah, FCPA is something maybe not that well known. I think Walmart, unfortunately for them, made it more well known a couple of years ago to their detriment. But essentially, it's a law. Technically, it's a U.S. law. They say it applies to all companies, but I don't really see how it does. So I think that it could potentially be a handicap for a U.S. company competing internationally. The penalties are pretty severe. So as an officer of a company, you want to make sure that you are not violating FCPA. A lot of it is about education. So whether it's your own employees or contractors, you need them to be trained on what's acceptable, not acceptable. You need to have them sign something saying that, and then you need to watch what they're doing. Essentially it has to do with cash. Largely it has to do with cash payments. But it can be tricky, right? Because you want to build a tower in a town, and the mayor of the town says, if you pay me 10,000 pesos, I will give you your permit. Can't do that. If the town fines you 10,000 pesos, you can pay the town. So it's a little kooky. This is, by the way, no set, it's all, you got to get your lawyer, get somebody who really knows FCPA's experience with it. I would probably suggest get whoever represented Walmart after the whole thing blew up, because they're probably really up to speed on it. But it is very important that you know what the rules are and that you and your contractors are following it. You can't just say, oh, my contractor was bribing people, but I didn't know anything about it. The risk is they'll look through you, so you really have to be on top of it.
So really, really important to find those local resources again.
And I think what Patrick said is really true. It's not just saying, oh, here's somebody who can do the job. It's who are they, what's their background, are they here to stay, have they been successful, what is motivating them to do their job, do what you want them to do correctly. Because they can get you in trouble just as well as your own employees can get you in trouble.
And who helps you find these local resources when you're going into a completely new area? How do you begin to approach that? How do you begin
we generally start with a law firm because you want to know the rules. I like to know the rules. I like to follow the rules.
Okay.
If you haven't gotten that. So you start with them, but generally you can start whatever vendors in the market. Different countries are very different in terms of like the skill base. So it's like anything else. You start networking, you hire contractors, you got to spend a lot of time there and talk to a lot of people and figure out who's active. I would imagine it's much more challenging in Myanmar where the business isn't built up.
Right.
Whereas if you're going into a market where there's already 4 active carriers and a network has been built, they've been operating, there's Nokia, Ericsson, etc. It's the same way you would do it here. You find the people who have been doing it. I guess in Myanmar you'd have to import people.
Yeah, pretty much exactly as Alex was saying. Full disclosure, I was a lawyer once upon a time, so I also generally called a law firm first of all, but was also an investment banker, I think, and a management consultant with McKinsey. So the only black mark you can't hold against me is that I'm not an accountant. But yeah, we also go straight to the local law firms. We obviously speak to the big 4 accounting firms. Generally speaking, we will have some element of local commercial partners involved in what we're doing. Certainly on the management team, we would insist on having people who have local access, and that often then spills directly into getting involved with companies that are relevant, that have, as Alex is saying, have, for instance, built or managed towers for the existing operators, or directly from the operators. We often get references to people. Somewhere like Myanmar is clearly a lot more complicated given the lack of infrastructure in the country more generally. There we've basically relied most heavily on construction companies, so companies that have built roads, that have built electric pylons, that have even put up buildings. And in those cases, we generally do have to do a fair amount of capacity building involving other foreign partners that we have from other countries that we bring in on a time-delimited basis, hopefully given the higher cost. But we hope to transition eventually to being able to rely more wholeheartedly on those local companies.
Okay, thank you, Patrick. All right, let's shift gears a little bit and talk specifically about some of the opportunities. Olivia, can you talk a little bit about the new spectrum deployments going on in some of your markets and the network upgrades?
Sure. Spectrum is, I think, is an issue everywhere. It was mentioned this morning regarding the US, whether it's scarcity, good quality, availability of spectrum in general. If you look at the different markets, while LTE is in full swing in the US and somehow in Europe and part of Southeast Asia, if you look at most of the emerging markets, it's well behind. I think Ben was mentioning 5 years behind this morning, maybe 2 to 5 years depending on which market you operate. Clearly, most of the deployments right now are from moving to the traditional 2G, GSM network to 3G. Some companies are even moving from old technology like Nextel with IDEN to traditional 3G and 4G technology, and we start to see the first deployment of 4G on some of the markets. Again, if you look at Latin America, some spectrum auctions have been granted this past year and a half, normally in high frequency. So the problems that the operators have regarding 4G deployment is the quality of really the networks that they're able to deploy on this 2.5, 2.1 gigahertz network. And most of them are actually just complying with the regulator indication or regulation in terms of basic 4G needs while waiting for the 700 megahertz availability in these markets. So it's a massive 3G deployment that we see everywhere. Most of these markets need basic infrastructure, so from this standpoint there is no scarcity of needs for any technology somehow. And 4G is just coming now to play in some of the markets like Brazil, Chile already auction the 700 megahertz band, so this is the first country in Latin America to do so. And we expect then again an uptake in terms of growth, you know, regarding infrastructure, like in the US, because of the data explosion that we foresee coming in this market. It's also, you know, playing with the availability of handsets. So far it's been quite expensive. So while in the US it's been manageable to launch 4G and have an average price of handset of $250 to $300, it's not the case in our market. When you go to Africa, Latin America, you have an ARPU of $6, $10. You need a handset which is no more than $100 or $120 and be a 4G handset as well. These handsets are coming now, I mean towards probably the end of the year into the market, and then we'll probably be able to see a massification of these networks.
So do you think the timeline and the path to 4G, maybe in Latin America, will be similar to what we've seen here, or will it be slower?
No, I think it will be similar. We see a lot of leapfrogging in these markets. If you remember WAP, for instance, in Europe, that came into play and then it died right away because 3G came. GPRS, the same. I mean, I think we're going to see the same, so an acceleration of 4G. I think the availability of 700 megahertz and the cost of these licenses will be key. We see, for instance, the Brazil government doing a lot of flexibility in the regulation around the 4G auctions in Brazil, which is good, both in terms of cost, in terms of sharing of spectrum potentially between operators, and then the handset and the infrastructure readiness with a low cost. So I think that will help a lot, especially in 2015 on massify the 4G auction.
Okay, thank you. Nathan, what are you seeing in your market?
Yeah, let me expand on that a little bit. 4G, as we know it, and the way my company felt about entering Africa, we were one of those people that drank the Kool-Aid about 4G LTE Africa. Broadband growth in Africa is far beyond anywhere else in the world. Mobile penetration is still relatively low and on a very good growth pattern. So we were very excited. We thought 5 to 6 years behind the US, which where I sit now, I laugh at that because it's much longer than that. And the reason in Southern Africa it's much longer than that is because it's the success of 2G. As was alluded to, most of Africa can't afford smartphone technology. It's not there yet. So they make do with a lot less than we have. A 2G phone in Africa is a radio, it's a flashlight, you can do Facebook on it, you can do mobile money or M-Pesa on it. So it's the lifeline that means that most of Africa doesn't need LTE to be advanced, to be able to communicate with the world. And so when I've talked to some senior executives of carriers in Africa, I've been surprised at them telling me, especially after me giving my pitch, right, that, hey, we're here to kind of help with your LTE and 4G, and then to say, well, okay, we've got it in urban areas, but that's not our profit center. The more profitable infrastructure in Africa is still the 2G world, and so we're getting asked to build sites in small villages and other places where there already is one site, and they need one across town now because people walk every Friday and Saturday for 2 hours to get to the village to do Facebook. That's where the money still is, at least in our neck of the world. So we've changed a little bit. We've gotten away from this idea of LTE and building a lot of great urban sites to kind of going back 10 years in the US world and building more coverage sites. So we'll be there when LTE is more prevalent, but right now it's not, and in the foreseeable future won't be, in my opinion.
Alex, what do you think?
Well, Olivia mentioned regulators, and I would just sort of add a comment that they can influence sort of the speed with which the technologies roll out, some more aggressively than others. It's been a while, I think, in the US since the regulators really pushed carriers to build maybe more than they wanted to. I think we saw what happened in the early 2000s, but in some markets, Brazil, for example, the regulators are very aggressively pushing the carriers to build out, to set standards. They've gone so far as to freezing sales of new handsets year before last in certain regions. One carrier in each region has sort of slapped their hand pretty severely. So, I don't think long term it changes the economics, but it does cause ripples if the regulator is forcing carriers to build more than they really want. It's great at first, but then I sort of look at it as there's a pothole in demand, because then they won't build. Once the pressure's off, they won't build. It's not too often you see that, but when it's particularly around auctions and new licenses, you can see that. And again, in the U.S., the restrictions have been so broad that, you know, it hasn't really affected the market in more than a decade here, but it does in other places.
Okay, great, thank you. What about DAS and small cells? Are these growing in emerging markets the way they are here, Olivier?
Yeah, I think it was interesting to hear the answers this morning because everybody had a different view on new technology, and I think we're all struggling, you know, as tower company to understand, first of all, what's the business model for tower companies there, and what's the value proposition of the company in the value chain. Because traditionally, you know, we've been very profitable managing a piece of real estate, which is a big tower, and which we have colocation and multiple tenants, and this is how we make our money. If you look at DAS and small cells, and I think Rod, you did this morning to the difference between both for us at American Tower, it's more difficult. You know, how do you ensure that in a small cell you have multiple tenants? How do you do that? How do you use the tower? Is it an access point potentially, you know, to ensure that you add flexibility for the operators from a backhaul standpoint, and that you bring these assets, you know, to increase capacity and density through small cells? The equation, the monetization of that for a company like us, it's a challenge. At least the way we've looked at that in the US, which has been the market so far, you know, leading the charge. That's a bit different because you see a lot of new venues where clearly either there's no coverage or the coverage is insufficient. So big shopping centers, stadiums, airports, and there is a need from day one potentially having 2 or 3 tenants. So then it becomes interesting. Of course, the cost of this system is much more in some cases than building a towers, because we talk about active DAS systems supporting multiple frequency, multiple operators. But it's definitely interesting when you look at the economics, because you start from day one, you know, with 2 or 3 operators. And strategically, of course, you tend to have a deeper relationship with the operator. You don't talk only about the tower and how you put the antenna, and you kind of extort them through this piece of infrastructure. And now you start, you know, looking at the future of technology, new deployments, and new products. So we've engaged into DAS actively in, I would say, Latin America heavily. US, we have a deep partnership with AT&T, for instance. We're starting in Africa and India, which is a little bit behind. Small cells, at least for us, still a question mark.
Okay, thank you. Does anybody else have any experience to share with DAS or small cells?
I would be curious to ask the rest of my panelists, because in my world, it's Wi-Fi offloading. That's all that anybody talks about. So there is no DAS. There's certainly no small cells. So I'm curious if in your markets you've seen that to be different.
Well, I mean, I think small cell, clearly there'll be a lot of offloading indoors. So if you want to call that small cell, that makes sense to me. And it makes sense to me that there'll be, you know, Wi-Fi-like routers that you would carry or hand to a customer and say, string these around your floor, and instead of a Wi-Fi router, it's just LTE on their frequency potentially. But I mean, as far as small cell go, I just have a simple rule of thumb, which is if, you know, it has to be more cost efficient, or carriers won't do it broadly. They may do it in certain select areas, but if it's, you know, 8 small cells to 1 macro cell, it better be 1/8 the cost of ownership all the way down the line, or why would they do it? And I think that's a tough equation.
I think on Wi-Fi, it's funny. In Latin America, it's not necessarily the case, Nathan, because I think the operators don't see the monetization of that. While in the US, it's a service when, you know, AT&T does offloading, for instance, to ensure that you get the best coverage wherever you are, whether it's through the traditional, you know, network calls or Wi-Fi. Carriers don't tend to see that this way in Latin America. So they prefer to see, you know, how they can differentiate from the others, still charging the consumer. And when you see at the fees and charges in general, the cost telecommunication in Latam, it's probably 3 to 4 times more expensive still than the US. So I don't know if it's a lack of education / maturity, but the business model regarding Wi-Fi is clearly not yet developed in Latam.
Okay, that's interesting. Okay, so, you know, DAS, small cells, Wi-Fi are opportunities maybe for carriers and for tower companies, but I think that in some of these overseas markets, there are revenue opportunities for your companies that would never exist in the US, and I'd like to talk a little bit about those before we open it up for questions. Alex, do you want to start us off here?
Sure. Well, I think one obvious way is in some parts of the world, particularly in Europe, the tower companies tend to also operate the network. So the broadcast-based tower companies like Arqiva or TDF, they actually operate the broadcast network for the country, basically. So they're not just a tower company, they're actually an engineering firm with studios, and they own the radios and the actual broadcast network. So that's one big source of revenue that you don't really have never seen here. I think power is sort of an opportunity and a curse depending how you look at it, but clearly tower companies have to be much more intimately involved with the power availability in a lot of places, much more so than here. Here it's sort of pretty easy. It's like get your own meter and pay the utility, and it's generally not an issue. And then I think there's a services opportunity here. One thing much more common in my experience, I'd be interested to see what you guys think is, the services are much more intimately connected. So for example, in Latin America, the same people who are at the tower install the tenant's equipment frequently for the anchor tenant. That's not as common here. Here you'll build a tower and then your anchor tenant will come in with their own crew and put the antennas up. So there's sort of an integrated service opportunity there on that side as well.
Any others?
I'll expand on my comment about utility management. One of the things we found in Southern Africa is China is very prevalent there. Chinese services companies, Huawei and ZTE, really have the tallest buildings in most towns. And if they're building a site for you, you can package up a lot more services, ongoing services into that program because they have immense scale and they offer some amazing pricing. So you can throw in security monitoring, you can throw in some utility management for the next 2 years. And again, my goal is to not have our tenants have any more reason to be upset with us than just building a simple tower. So we've tried to get away from being too management heavy and give that to somebody else, but we have used Huawei ZTE to give us some really good scalability on some of those additional services, at least for the short term, to say that we can do it, and then maybe we figure out not to do it 12 months after we build.
I mean, my perspective is pretty similar to what I'm hearing from my co-panelists, is that getting it right with the actual tower is probably the most important thing, because that's the core part of the business. But there are potentially some opportunities there. I tend to have a negative bias towards a lot of them, but there are a lot of potential opportunities. So if you look at some emerging markets, I mean, just the very fact of putting a tower there that's got communications and has power associated with it tends to result in some amount of increase in value of neighboring land around that tower, particularly as you get out in these more rural areas, alluding to the point Nathan was making. And, we regularly have these internal debates where people say, well, let's lease land next to the tower and have a quasi-shopping mall effectively because that land is going to be worth a lot of money. But, it's just, at some point these ideas are fascinating to think about, but it's hard to know when they become more distractions than actual return-generating investments.
I've always felt like the challenge is the tower business is so good, it's really hard to find things that match it in terms of return on your capital. So, and in a time when things are very active, you're putting everything you have into deploying into the tower market. So, and these ancillary opportunities, while they're attractive, they're not as good.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a very tempting value proposition. It's even sexier sometimes than the tower piece. You look to have a stickier relationship with the operators by providing a kind of array of full services from security, maintenance, a network operating center, definitely power management in countries like Africa. We do that in Colombia, by the way, for instance, with Medicom. We have this kind of full swing SLA doing everything for them. The problem is modelization. So, the returns are not necessarily there. Predictability of cost. We are not specialists. As Nathan was saying, guys like Huawei and ZTE are much better than we are doing that and much cheaper. So then you have, problem of cost and margin, which becomes an issue. Then do we have to play with these guys, be part of, a broader value proposition? Maybe, but then you need resources, you need to add a lot of people to help these guys build. So there's a lot of, then questions that pop up regarding the sustainability of this kind of proposals.
All right, yeah, that's great. Does anybody else have anything else on other business models or other opportunities before we open it up for questions from the audience? Okay, great. Well, I would like to open it up for questions, and if you do have a question, please let us know whether or not it is for a specific panelist. No questions. Okay. Oh, yeah.
You mentioned the challenge with power. What about challenges with backhaul?
Well, let me just throw in something, maybe not to be totally flippant, but one of our challenges with backhaul is to make sure we price the space on the tower correctly to the extent microwaves are required. I think, but in all seriousness, that actually the pricing model is something that's pretty important for us. Somewhere like Vietnam, there's quite a lot of fiber. Offloading onto fiber is pretty straightforward. Somewhere like Myanmar, they don't even have a tower, never mind fiber as a general matter. So, what we negotiate with our tenants in terms of the capacity they can take and the wind loading is probably my major concern when it comes to that, more than their ability to eventually offload onto fiber.
I would just add that in South Africa, American Tower, when they got into the market, went through an acquisition of towers, and they brought some staff from the carrier, Cell C. And so when I'm talking to carriers, they ask me to do everything. They ask us to do it all, because American Tower, in some version or another, has done it all initially, managed backhaul. And so now they don't do that today, but when they first did the acquisition, so ditto. I mean, I have to say, no, listen, we're the passive stuff, we're the simple stuff. We're not good at that. You don't want us to do that. We win some, we lose some.
There may be something interesting when you look at small cells deployment, issue between backhaul and some cells at small cells, and what's the role of the towers once you have 6,000, 10,000 towers, and as an access point to potentially ease a little bit the work of the operators regarding backhaul and connection with the small cells. So this is something we're looking at. Again, monetization of that may be an issue, but there may be a role to play depending on the size and the scale that you have in the markets.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Yes?
I'd like to know your comments in regards of what are you seeing in terms of safety and training compliance as it compares to the United States and the territories that we're business.
So what's the saying? When in Rome, do as the Romans, right? And that's, I guess I'd like to say that's not me speaking, that's other people. But let's face it, I've talked to plenty of other tower companies, CEOs in Africa, and we've talked about this. If you're an American company and you're going to another country, yes, there is this belief that you're bringing another level of expertise, safety, security, but at the end of the day, that's hurting you. That's hurting you if you're gonna do something above and beyond what the government requires from a safety perspective or an OSHA perspective. Then you're not being profitable and you're not doing your LPs any favors because you're minimizing the returns. So I mean, I guess I should leave it at that. That's kind of a loaded question, by the way.
I think unless the carriers are committed to it, there's really no benefit.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it really is carrier driven at the end of the day, what they can push you to do. But I think it's, there's formal compliance, and I'm sure we all have the formal programs. Everyone's meant to wear a hat and safety harness, et cetera, et cetera. There's the informal norms of the country. The countries I'm operating in, it's not uncommon for workers to be wearing flip-flops rather than work boots. And then I think, while it may not be it's not an economic topic, but there's purely the ethical question of how one thinks about this stuff. I think, I'm sure all of us have the desire that our workers are not going to get injured and that they're working in safe conditions, and we certainly do emphasize it beyond the formal compliance program, but in the end of the day, a lot of it really is dependent on our subcontractors, and there's only so deep one can go with the message and the monitoring of those subcontractors.
I think that on top of I would say, the question, the way it was asked this morning for the US, the additional complexity in emerging markets is the security of the market itself. So when you operate in Colombia or Nigeria, you know, good or bad, you're going to have potentially issue in some pockets of these markets. So in our case, we do operate in some of these markets. Colombia is one. We have additional training, and we try to have, you know, a lot of specific tools around management of our towers to get information as soon as possible when there is an accident, an issue, a village potentially, you know, where there is unrest. But again, that's when you do your due diligence before entering this market. So that's something that weighs, you know, as part of the equation.
Excuse me, do you find a shortage of workers to actually work on the cell towers as well in the marketplaces? Anyone, general question.
Again, going back to ZTE and Huawei's influence in Africa, no shortage at all. A lot of Chinese nationals working in Africa, a lot of Mandarin language pamphlets, safety documents. I mean, you'd be amazed.
If you pay well, you'll find a guy.
Okay, great. Well, one thing we haven't discussed is the role of carriers as tower owners overseas. Oh, I'm so sorry.
Man down.
Yeah. Here we see a lot of carriers selling tower assets. Do you see that overseas, or do you see that coming overseas?
Yeah, maybe I can start. I mean, yes, I think the trend is everywhere for different reasons. I mean, some you know, operators just sell the assets either because they need it. They are, you know, highly indebted company. You see Telefonica or Telecom Italia, for instance, in the case of two players in Latin America, they have to do it. Some is because they just don't see that as strategic. This is passive infrastructure that prefer to allocate their capital in other areas of their business. You also see some operators that believe in the tower economics. In this case, you know, you have potentially JVs and partnership with tower companies to do that together, so that you can grow the value of these assets, you know, to get more cash flow, and then sell that back either to the towerco with whom they're partnering or to somebody else. So in our case, we have, you know, a partnership and JVs in Africa and in Colombia. Some carriers are thinking of doing the same. So, but overall, what we see, yes, this is a constant interest and increase in activities in terms of availability of portfolio, I would say, in the market we work with.
Okay, great. Anybody else to ask?
I think there's, I've been around a long time, and there's an evolution. You know, if you go back to when, you know, Crown and American founded the business in the U.S., you know, a lot of people, including me, was like, Beltmanic's never going to sell the towers. Like, that's never going to happen. And I think that different carriers go through the evolution of the process of they're strategic, I won't let anybody on them because that's my competitive advantage. Then they go to, okay, I'll swap. And then, all right, maybe I'll let them on and make some money. And then they either monetize or they'll create a, you know, a T-Mobile tower, AT&T tower kind of structure, sometimes joint venture, which is very smart, sometimes themselves. I think an interesting example is Telcel, Claro. They're sort of still in the mode of, you know, we're going to build all our own towers. That, you know, they don't do a lot of co-location. Some countries they do none because they feel like they have a lot of capital. They generally have huge market share, and they look at it. They're still sort of 20 years ago in terms of the thinking of our towers are strategic, and if we're the #1 guy, and if we don't let anybody on our towers, then we'll have a better market share. And I think it'll be interesting to watch them gradually come out of that. I think they are. They're co-locating more and more. You know, it wasn't that long ago here where Verizon only built, right? They never did build to suit 2-3 years ago. They didn't do, we're going to build all our own towers. It's just, so to me, there's sort of a evolutionary process that carriers go through. Ultimately, they make money by competing for customers and winning those customers and keeping them happy. And they don't make money stranding their capital into towers. And that's why all around the world, over time, largely led by American Tower, carriers are coming to that conclusion. And I think that'll continue.
I would add a unique twist to that. And in Africa, we've got Econet, MTN, Airtel, all of which are thinking about or in the process of selling assets. They all have different reasons for doing it. but I've talked to some in Burundi, Rwanda. Their objectives for selling their assets is more not what you're used to in the US, where they reinvest in their network to do 4G or something else. It's an exit play. It's to take care of their shareholders and move away, or put their money into another operating company, buy spectrum someplace else, shore up another place, another market. So there's been a lot of carriers saying, yeah, let's do this. How can we do this? And why do you want to do this? Well, the reasons for doing it aren't good if you're going to buy their assets. If they're not trying to compete to be number one in that market, you don't want to buy those assets. If they're going to take that money and become number one in their next operating code next door in another country, then save your money. And I've been surprised that the multiples in Africa are going up because people aren't asking these deep questions and they're not getting the right answers.
It's a great insight. Okay, well, we are out of time. I want to thank you all very much. This has been great. Nathan Foster is president of Atlas Tower. Thank you for being here. Olivia Quech is CEO for Latin America at American Tower. Thank you very much, Olivia. Alex Gelman is CEO of Vertical Bridge Holdings. Thank you. And Patrick Tangney is chairman of GT of Golden Towers. Thank you very much, Patrick.
Thank you.
Thank you all.